Thursday, 9:47 p.m. The knock came in three sharp bursts that cut through the quiet of the Riverside Heights apartment like a judge's gavel. James Mitchell froze mid-motion, the worn teddy bear he'd been tucking beside his daughter's pillow still clutched in his hand. Emma's eyes had just drifted shut, her breathing settling into the steady rhythm that meant she'd finally stopped fighting sleep. The knock came again, louder this time, and James felt his stomach drop. Nobody knocked at this hour. Not in this building, not on a Thursday night when the hallways smelled like reheated dinners and the elevator groaned its way between floors carrying residents who kept to themselves. He pulled Emma's door almost closed, leaving just enough gap to hear if she woke, and moved through the living room on autopilot. His mind cataloged the scattered evidence of their evening. The solar system project sprawled across the coffee table, planets cut from construction paper waiting to be hung, glitter everywhere despite his best efforts to contain it. Emma's backpack hung on a hook by the door, permission slips he hadn't signed yet stuffed in the front pocket. The dishes from their macaroni and cheese dinner still sat in the sink because he'd chosen homework help over cleanup, and now someone was pounding on his door like they had a right to interrupt the fragile peace he'd fought all day to maintain. The peephole showed him exactly what he didn't want to see. Patricia Cole stood in the hallway, still in the black dress and heels she must have worn to the gala he'd completely forgotten about. Her natural hair was pulled back tight, emphasizing the set of her jaw, and the way her shoulders carried the kind of authority that made junior employees straighten their spines when she walked past their desks. James had worked at Cole Technologies for 4 years, long enough to recognize every shade of Patricia's professional mask, but the expression on her face right now didn't fit any category he knew. She looked angry. No, worse than angry. She looked disappointed in a way that made his throat close up. He opened the door because refusing would only delay whatever was coming, and the words hit him before he could get his mouth open to apologize. "You're fired." The hallway fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting harsh shadows that made Patricia's dark skin look almost gray. James heard himself make a sound, something between a laugh and a gasp, because the absurdity of it collided with the terror of it, and his brain couldn't process both at once. Fired. At 9:47 on a Thursday night, delivered to his doorstep by the CEO herself, still wearing gala clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "Ms. Cole, I can explain." "Don't." Patricia's voice cut through his attempt at damage control. "Don't tell me you can explain missing the Innovation Excellence Award ceremony where you were supposed to receive recognition for 8 months of work that exceeded every benchmark we set. Don't tell me you can explain ignoring 3 emails and 5 phone calls today. I've been trying to talk to you for weeks, James, and you've been treating every attempt like background noise you can tune out when it gets inconvenient." The words came too fast for James to grab onto any single thread and pull. Innovation Award. He'd known about that, hadn't he? The memory surfaced through the fog of exhaustion that had become his permanent state. An email from HR 2 weeks ago, something about formal attire and a 7 o'clock start time. He'd meant to put it in his calendar. He'd meant to do a lot of things that had gotten buried under the weight of everything else demanding his attention in any given hour. "I forgot." The admission tasted like failure. Emma had her science project due tomorrow, and the bathroom sink started leaking again, and I had to debug that module for the client presentation, and I forgot. Patricia's expression didn't soften. If anything, the disappointment deepened, carving lines around her mouth that James had never noticed before. She opened her mouth to respond, but a small voice from behind James cut through whatever she'd been about to say. "Daddy, who's at the door?" James turned to find Emma standing in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes with one hand while the other dragged Peanut the elephant across the hardwood floor. Her Wonder Woman pajamas were twisted from sleep, and her hair stuck up in directions that defied physics. She blinked at Patricia with the kind of unfiltered curiosity that only 6-year-olds could muster at 10 o'clock at night, tilting her head to one side in a gesture so reminiscent of Jennifer that James felt the grief spike through his chest like it always did when his daughter accidentally mimicked her dead mother. "It's just someone from work, sweetie. Go back to bed." Emma ignored him completely, padding forward on bare feet until she stood between James and the doorway, looking up at Patricia with the intensity of a detective gathering clues. "Are you my daddy's boss? He talks about you a lot. He says you're really smart, but sometimes scary." Heat flooded James's face. He'd never said that out loud, had he? But apparently he had, probably during one of those late nights when he thought Emma was asleep and he'd been pacing the living room trying to work through some problem, muttering to himself about Patricia's impossible standards and the way she saw through every excuse before he'd finished forming it. Patricia's stern expression cracked. She knelt down, bringing herself to Emma's eye level, and something shifted in her face that James had never witnessed in 4 years of quarterly reviews and project debriefs. The CEO mask slipped, revealing someone softer underneath, someone who looked at his daughter with genuine warmth, instead of the calculated interest she showed clients. "Yes, I am. And you must be Emma. Your dad has pictures of you all over his desk. You're even prettier in person." Emma absorbed the compliment with the seriousness of someone receiving classified information. Then her expression shifted, worry creeping into her features in a way that made James want to scoop her up and carry her back to bed before this conversation could leave marks she'd remember tomorrow. "Are you firing my daddy?" Her lower lip trembled slightly. "Because he works really hard. Sometimes he stays up all night doing his computer stuff after I go to bed. I can hear him typing when I get up for water. And he always makes sure I have breakfast even when he's really tired. He makes the best scrambled eggs. He puts cheese in them." The words landed like punches. James felt his chest constrict, caught between pride that his daughter would defend him and mortification that she'd noticed the late nights, the exhaustion, all the things he'd tried to hide behind forced smiles and weekend pancakes. He reached for Emma's shoulder, ready to redirect this entire disaster, but Patricia spoke first. "That's exactly why I'm here." Her voice had gentled in a way James had never heard before, all the sharp edges filed down to something almost tender. She looked up at him, and something unreadable flickered behind her eyes. "May I come in? I think we need to talk." James wanted to refuse. He wanted to close the door and pretend this night had never happened, that he could show up at the office tomorrow and everything would reset to the normal level of barely functional chaos that defined his life. But Patricia was already standing, and Emma was looking at him with those eyes that were too much like Jennifer's, and saying no to the CEO who'd just fired him seemed like a faster route to complete disaster than whatever awaited him on the other side of letting her in. He stepped aside. Patricia entered his apartment like she was crossing into foreign territory, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood with each step. James watched her take in the details he'd stopped seeing months ago. The laundry basket overflowing with clothes he hadn't folded, the stack of unopened mail on the side table that grew taller every week, the crayon drawings taped to every available wall surface because Emma was going through an artistic phase and he couldn't bring himself to limit her self-expression. Jennifer would have had systems for all of this. She'd had systems for everything, color-coded calendars and labeled bins, and a way of moving through their shared life that made chaos into order without ever seeming to break a sweat. James had tried to maintain those systems after she died, but they'd crumbled like sandcastles against the tide of single parenthood and full-time work and grief that ambushed him in grocery store aisles when he saw her favorite cereal. Emma tugged on Patricia's hand with the confidence of a child who'd decided this stranger was safe. "Do you want to see my room? I have a science corner. Daddy helped me make a solar system that glows in the dark, and I have a poster of Mae Jemison because she was the first black woman in space. She's my hero, her and Wonder Woman, and my mommy." The casual mention of Jennifer hit James harder than it should have after 3 years. Emma talked about her mother the way she talked about historical figures now, someone important who existed in stories and photographs but not in the present tense of their daily life. He should probably be grateful she remembered it all, that the 2 years she'd had with Jennifer before the cancer had left enough imprints to survive. But gratitude felt distant when what he actually felt was the old familiar ache of trying to be 2 parents in one body and failing at both. Patricia glanced at James, seeking permission or maybe giving him an escape route. He managed to nod because refusing would require explanations he didn't have energy for, and watching his boss get dragged down the hallway by his daughter seemed marginally better than whatever confrontation awaited them in the kitchen. "I'll make tea," he said to no one in particular, and escaped. The kitchen gave him 30 seconds of breathing room. James filled the kettle with shaking hands, his mind racing through every possible reason Patricia would drive 40 minutes from the Harrington Grand Hotel to his apartment on a Thursday night. Fired. She'd said fired, but people didn't get fired at their front doors at 10 o'clock unless the offense was catastrophic. Had he missed something bigger than the gala? Some deadline that slipped past him in the blur of Emma's dentist appointments and parent-teacher conferences and the constant low-grade panic that he was forgetting something crucial? He could hear Emma's voice from down the hall, bright with enthusiasm as she explained her solar system project. Patricia's responses came softer, engaged in a way that surprised him. She asked follow-up questions about why Pluto deserved planet status, and Emma launched into a passionate defense that would have made any debate coach proud. James pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, chamomile tea because it was all he had, Jennifer's favorite that he kept buying 3 years after her death because stopping felt like erasing another piece of her existence. 15 minutes stretched into 20 before Emma finally agreed to go back to bed, bargaining for just 5 more minutes that turned into a detailed explanation of every glow-in-the-dark planet hanging from her ceiling. James heard Patricia's patient acknowledgement of each celestial body, the kind of genuine interest most adults faked when children talked, and something uncomfortable shifted in his chest. He'd built such a specific image of Patricia Cole in his mind, the intimidating CEO who demanded perfection and accepted no excuses, whose approval he chased through late nights and weekend work because proving himself felt like the only currency that mattered. This version of her, kneeling on his daughter's bedroom floor and learning about planetary injustice from a 6-year-old, didn't fit anywhere in that framework. When Patricia finally emerged and settled into the chair across from him at the small kitchen table, James had the tea ready and absolutely no idea what to say. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. He studied the chamomile bag steeping in her mug, watched the way her hands wrapped around the ceramic for warmth, even though the apartment was stuffy with late spring heat. "I don't understand." The words came out rougher than he'd intended. "If you're firing me, why show up here at 10 o'clock at night? Why not just call me into your office tomorrow and handle it through HR like a normal termination?" Patricia sighed, and the sound carried weight he couldn't measure. She looked different under his kitchen's fluorescent light, less polished and more human, like the drive here had stripped away some protective layer she wore at the office. When she met his eyes, James saw something that looked almost like concern and that scared him more than anger would have. "Because you wouldn't have heard me there either. You haven't been hearing anyone for months, James. I've sent emails. I've left notes on your desk. I scheduled 3 separate meetings that you either rescheduled or attended while simultaneously answering messages on your phone like I was some minor interruption you could multitask through. Last Tuesday, I stood in your office for 3 full minutes before you even noticed I was there. You were so deep in that code that I could have set your desk on fire and you would have asked me to move the flame so you could see your monitor better." The accuracy of the observation felt like an indictment. James opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain that multitasking was survival when every hour held more demands than minutes. But Patricia kept talking. "I know you've been meeting all your deadlines. Your work is exceptional. It's why you were getting that award tonight. But at what cost?" She leaned forward, and the movement brought her face into sharper focus. "You look exhausted, James. You've lost weight since last summer. Your team members are worried about you. Brandon told me last week that he tried to ask you about a module integration, and you stared through him like he was made of glass. And tonight, when you missed the gala where 200 people were gathered to celebrate your innovation, I realized that waiting for you to ask for help was the same as watching you drown." The words hit too close to something James had been refusing to look at directly for months. Yes, he was tired. Yes, he was barely holding everything together. But admitting that felt like admitting failure, like proving he couldn't handle the life circumstances had handed him. Single fathers didn't get to fall apart. Black men in corporate America didn't get to show weakness. And parents who'd made promises to dying spouses about taking care of their children didn't get to complain that the weight was too heavy. "I'm managing." Even as he said it, James heard how hollow the claim sounded. Managing implied some level of control, some sense that he was steering rather than just hanging on while life happened to him at speed. Are you? Patricia's challenge came gentle but firm. Because from where I'm sitting, you're running yourself into the ground. And I can't. She stopped, something flickering across her face that looked almost like pain. I can't watch you do that. The shift from professional observation to personal investment caught James off guard. He studied Patricia's expression, searching for the angle he'd missed, the corporate calculation that made his burnout her problem. But what he found instead was something raw and real, an emotion that didn't belong in the careful distance between CEO and employee. Why? The question came out sharper than he'd intended. Why do you care what happens to me outside office hours? I'm just another employee, another line item in your quarterly reports. Patricia flinched like he'd slapped her. She set down her mug with deliberate precision, and when she spoke again, her voice carried weight he'd never heard before. My fiancé died 7 years ago. The words dropped into the space between them like stones into still water. His name was Robert. We were 6 months from the wedding when he wrapped his car around a tree on Highway 85. I threw myself into building this company because working 20-hour days was easier than going home to an apartment that still had his clothes in the closet and his coffee mug in the sink. I pushed away everyone who tried to help because accepting help felt like admitting I couldn't handle it alone. And if I couldn't handle it alone, what did that say about me? James sat frozen, every assumption he'd built about Patricia Cole crumbling like a structure with its foundation removed. In 4 years of working for her, he'd never known this. She'd always seemed so complete, so perfectly self-contained, like someone who'd never needed another person for anything more substantial than signing off on quarterly projections. I nearly destroyed myself. Patricia's gaze didn't waver. My doctor told me I was 6 months from a serious health crisis if I didn't change course. My sister showed up at my apartment one night and told me I was fired from grieving alone. She sat me down and made me look at what I was doing to myself. Really look, not through the lens of productivity or achievement, but through the eyes of someone who loved me and was terrified of losing me too. The parallel sat between them, unspoken but obvious. James felt something crack in his chest, some wall he'd built to keep the grief and exhaustion contained behind good enough parenting and acceptable work performance. He'd been so focused on surviving each day that he'd stopped asking whether survival was the same thing as living. What changed? His voice came out barely above a whisper. Patricia smiled, sad and warm at once. I learned that accepting help wasn't weakness. I learned that the people I'd been pushing away weren't trying to fix me. They were trying to stand beside me while I figured out how to fix myself. And I learned that honoring Robert's memory didn't mean working myself to death. It meant building a life he would have been proud of, which required actually having a life instead of just an endless string of 18-hour days. She reached across the table, hesitating for just a moment before placing her hand over his. Her skin was warm against his, and the contact sent something electric through him that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with being seen. Really seen, maybe for the first time since Jennifer's funeral, when people had looked at him with pity instead of recognition. I see myself in you, James. I see someone drowning in dignity, refusing every life preserver because accepting one feels like admitting defeat. And I'm here to tell you that there's no honor in drowning alone. Emma deserves a father who's present, not just physically but emotionally. The company deserves the brilliant engineer you are when you're not running on fumes and anxiety. And you, her grip tightened slightly, you deserve more than just survival. James felt tears threaten behind his eyes and forced them back with the practiced discipline of a man who'd learned to save his crying for the shower. But Patricia's words had opened something he'd kept locked down for 3 years, and holding it closed took energy he didn't have left. I wouldn't even know where to start. The admission felt like stripping naked in front of his boss, exposing every failure and inadequacy he'd been hiding behind competent code and on-time project delivery. Patricia pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. You start by accepting help. Executive health plan that covers dependents at 100%. Flexible scheduling, remote work options. The parents' network at Cole Technologies, other employees who are balancing careers and kids. Counseling services. Emergency backup childcare. Every resource the company offers that you've been too proud or too buried to use." James stared at the folder like it might bite him. The practical part of his brain, the part that had kept him employed and housed and feeding his daughter for 3 years, recognized what Patricia was offering: real support, structural changes that could actually make a difference instead of just platitudes about work-life balance from people who went home to partners and full nights of sleep. But accepting felt like admitting he'd been failing. It felt like proving he couldn't handle what Jennifer had made look effortless, that he was less capable alone than she'd been while fighting cancer and raising a toddler simultaneously. Pride and shame tangled in his throat, choking off the thank you he knew he should offer. "Why are you doing this?" He needed to understand the angle, the corporate logic that made his personal crisis worth a CEO's attention. "You could have just written me up for missing the gala. You could have handled this through proper channels instead of showing up at my door like some kind of intervention." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same care she brought to board presentations. "Because I see myself in you. Because Emma deserves better than watching her father work himself to death. Because you're too valuable to lose to burnout." She paused, then added more softly, "And because everyone deserves someone who cares enough to knock on their door and tell them when they're destroying themselves." The honesty in her voice cracked something open in James that he'd been keeping sealed through sheer force of will. For 3 years, he'd been the strong one, the one who held everything together, the one who made it work no matter what it cost him personally. He'd been father and mother, breadwinner and homemaker, grief counselor and grief counselor's patient, all rolled into one exhausted body that was running out of reserves it didn't have. "I'm scared." The words slipped out before he could stop them. "I'm scared that if I slow down, if I let myself feel how tired I actually am, I won't be able to start moving again, that everything I've been holding together will just collapse and I won't be able to put it back." Patricia's expression softened into something that looked like understanding earned through experience. "I know. I've been there. I've stood exactly where you're standing and felt exactly what you're feeling. But here's what I learned. The things we're holding together through sheer force of will, those things don't actually need us to white-knuckle them into submission. They need us to be whole enough to handle them properly. You can't be the father Emma needs if you're too exhausted to see straight. You can't do your best work if you're running on 3 hours of sleep and stress hormones." She was right. James knew she was right with the same certainty he'd been refusing to acknowledge for months. But knowing and accepting were different animals, and accepting meant facing all the ways he'd been lying to himself about his ability to sustain this pace indefinitely. "The Phoenix Project deadline," he started, grasping for the familiar territory of work problems instead of personal ones. "We're 3 weeks out and there's still—" "The deadline was extended 2 weeks ago." Patricia cut through his deflection with surgical precision. "The client requested additional features, which gives us more time and more budget. I've been trying to tell you that for days, but you've been too buried to listen. The crisis you've been sprinting toward doesn't exist anymore, James. You can breathe." The information took several seconds to process. Extended, more time. The pressure that had been driving his late nights and weekend work, the deadline he'd been sacrificing sleep and meals to meet, had evaporated 2 weeks ago, and he'd been too disconnected to notice. The realization should have brought relief, but what James felt instead was a crushing wave of exhaustion, like his body had been waiting for permission to acknowledge how depleted it actually was. "I've been running for nothing," he said it out loud, hearing the words and still struggling to believe them. "I've been drowning myself for a deadline that doesn't exist." "You've been drowning yourself because you've forgotten that you're allowed to come up for air." Patricia's correction came firm but kind. "And I'm here to remind you. Consider this your official firing from the idea that grinding yourself into dust is the same thing as being a good father or a good employee." James looked at her across the small kitchen table. This woman who'd driven across the city to deliver an intervention disguised as a termination, and felt something shift in his understanding of who Patricia Cole actually was beneath the CEO title. She wasn't just his boss. She was someone who'd walked this road before him and come out the other side still breathing. And she was offering him a map through territory he'd been navigating blind. "What if I can't do it?" The question came out small, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be since Jennifer's funeral. What if I try to slow down and I just fail differently? Patricia met his eyes with steady certainty. Then you fail differently, but at least you'll be rested enough to notice and course correct. Right now, you're failing in slow motion and you're too exhausted to see it happening. That's not strength, James. That's just stubbornness with better PR. The words stung because they were true. James had been calling his relentless pace dedication when it was really just fear dressed up in productivity metrics. Fear that slowing down meant letting go of Jennifer. Fear that asking for help meant admitting he wasn't enough. Fear that if he stopped moving for even a moment, the grief would catch up and pull him under. Okay. The word came out rough, barely loud enough to count as speech. Okay, I'll try. I'll look at the resources. I'll accept the help. But I need you to know. He paused, searching for the right way to frame it. I need this to be real support, not just corporate window dressing. I need it to actually work, because if I reorganize my entire life around these accommodations and then the company pulls them back when budget gets tight, I won't survive it. Patricia's expression hardened into something fierce. You have my word. These aren't temporary band-aids, James. They're permanent changes to how we support employees who are carrying weight outside office hours. You won't be the only one benefiting. There are 12 other single parents at Cole Technologies who've been struggling in silence just like you. Your situation is just the one that finally made me stop talking about family-friendly policies and start implementing them. The scope of what she was describing settled over James like a blanket. This wasn't about him, or rather, it was about him, but not only him, and that somehow made accepting it easier. He wasn't taking charity. He was being the test case for structural change that would help others like him, and that felt different than just accepting a handout. When do I start? He gestured at the folder still sitting between them. What's the first step? Patricia checked her watch. Nearly 11 now, the hours having slipped past while they sat in his kitchen rebuilding the foundation of their working relationship into something more human. First step is you take tomorrow off. Sleep in. Make Emma breakfast without rushing. Read the materials in that folder. Call the counseling service and schedule your first appointment. And on Monday, you come into my office and we draft a formal plan that works for your actual life instead of the theoretical version where you have 8 extra hours in every day. James nodded, the motion feeling heavy with significance. Tomorrow. He could start tomorrow. Not with some massive transformation, but with sleep and breakfast and reading a folder, 3 small things that felt impossibly large after months of running at full speed. Patricia stood, and James followed her to the door on autopilot. The apartment felt different now, like something had shifted in the air during their conversation, some pressure valve released that he hadn't realized was keeping everything compressed. At the threshold, Patricia turned back. James, the Innovation Award. You earned it. The work you did on Phoenix was exceptional, and missing the ceremony doesn't change that. We'll figure out another way to recognize it properly. Heat crept up James's neck. I'm sorry I missed it. I know it was important. It was. But you know what's more important? Patricia gestured back toward Emma's room. That little girl in there who's going to wake up tomorrow with a father who's maybe starting to remember that he's allowed to take care of himself too. That's worth more than a plaque and a ballroom full of people clapping politely. She left before James could formulate a response, her heels clicking down the hallway toward the elevator. James closed the door and leaned against it, the weight of the evening settling into his bones alongside the exhaustion he'd been denying for months. On the kitchen table, the folder waited with its promises of structural support and actual change. In her room, Emma slept peacefully, unaware that her casual defense of her father had sparked the intervention that might actually save him. James pushed off the door and made his way through the apartment, turning off lights and straightening the scattered remnants of their evening. The solar system project could wait until tomorrow. The dishes could wait. The unopened mail could wait. For the first time in 3 years, James allowed himself to believe that not everything required his immediate attention, that some things could simply exist in their unfinished state until he had the energy to address them properly. He checked on Emma before heading to his own room, adjusting her blanket and moving Peanut the elephant closer to her pillow. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, and James stood there for a moment watching her sleep, this small person who'd become his entire reason for functioning. She deserved better than a father who was too tired to be fully present. She deserved the version of him that could engage with her homework instead of just checking that it was complete. She deserved the kind of attention Jennifer would have given, patient and focused and unhurried. In his own room, James caught sight of himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. Patricia was right. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and the shadows under his eyes had become permanent residents. He looked like a man running from something instead of toward anything, and the realization hit him with uncomfortable clarity. This was what drowning looked like from the inside. This was what happened when survival became the only goal and thriving became some distant luxury he'd stopped believing he deserved. He fell into bed still wearing his clothes from work, too tired to bother changing. The folder Patricia left sat on his kitchen table like a promise or a challenge, and James let himself imagine what it might feel like to actually use the resources inside it. 40-hour work weeks. Time to pick Emma up from school instead of rushing from aftercare programs. Mental space to notice when she needed new shoes or had a permission slip due. The possibility of a life that didn't require constant triage felt almost fictional, but Patricia had looked at him tonight with the eyes of someone who'd walked this road and found a way through. Sleep pulled at him, heavy and insistent, but James's mind kept circling back to the moment when Patricia's hand had covered his, the warmth of human contact he'd been denying himself for 3 years. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen by another adult, to have someone witness his struggle and respond with something other than advice or pity. Patricia had offered neither. Instead, she'd offered partnership, a kind of standing beside rather than standing over, and that distinction mattered in ways James was still working to understand. Tomorrow he would read the folder. Tomorrow he would make the phone calls and start accepting the help he'd been refusing. Tomorrow he would begin the slow work of remembering that survival and living weren't synonyms, that he owed Emma more than just keeping them afloat. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, James let himself stop. He stopped planning. He stopped worrying. He stopped running through mental checklists of everything undone. He simply existed in the quiet darkness of his room, breathing in and out, and allowed himself to believe that maybe Patricia was right. Maybe accepting help wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the bravest thing he could do. Friday morning arrived with sunlight that felt unfamiliar, the kind that comes from waking naturally instead of to an alarm's violent intrusion. James opened his eyes to find it was already 8:30, a time he hadn't seen from bed in months. Panic spiked through him before memory caught up. Emma, school, the careful orchestration of their morning routine that couldn't tolerate this kind of deviation. But Patricia had said, take the day, sleep in, be a father instead of a machine processing tasks. He found Emma in the kitchen, standing on the step stool Jennifer had bought her, making a disaster of the counter with cereal and milk. She'd dressed herself in striped leggings that clashed magnificently with a polka-dot shirt, and her attempt at ponytails had resulted in 2 lopsided arrangements that defied symmetry. I made breakfast for us. Pride radiated from her like heat. Because you were sleeping and I'm a big girl now. The cereal had missed the bowl more often than not, creating a crunchy minefield across the laminate countertop. Milk pooled in places it shouldn't. But Emma stood there beaming, and James felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the mess and everything to do with the small person who'd decided her tired father needed care. You did great, Bug. He lifted her off the stool and set her at the table, then grabbed a towel to manage the overflow. How about I make us scrambled eggs too, the kind with cheese? Can we eat slow? Emma swung her legs under the chair. Like on weekends? Because Ms. Laura said I don't have to be at school until Monday. She called last night after you were talking to the boss lady. James froze mid-wipe. Ms. Davis had called? He pulled his phone from the charger and found 3 missed calls and a voicemail from Emma's teacher, all time-stamped during his conversation with Patricia. The message was brief. Field trip to the Science Museum today. Permission slip required. Emma could either attend or take an excused absence since James had forgotten to sign. The trip had left at 7 this morning. Guilt surged hot and immediate. Another thing he'd missed. Another ball dropped in the constant juggling act. But Emma didn't look upset. If anything, she seemed pleased with this unexpected reprieve from routine. "Yeah, we can eat slow." James cracked eggs into a bowl, whisking with more force than necessary. "And then maybe we go to the park. Do normal Friday things instead of rushing." Emma's squeal of delight made the guilt worth carrying. When had he last taken her to the park on a weekday? When had they last done anything that wasn't scheduled and rushed and crammed between other obligations? They ate at the kitchen table without the television on, without James checking email on his phone, without the artificial urgency that usually defined their mornings. Emma talked about her solar system project and her friend Zoe, whose dad worked at Cole Technologies too, and how Ms. Laura had let her be line leader twice this week because she'd helped another kid with math. James listened, actually listened, instead of half-processing while his brain cataloged everything else demanding attention, and felt the muscle memory of presence start to rebuild itself. After breakfast, he opened Patricia's folder while Emma colored at the table beside him. The executive health plan documentation ran 30 pages deep, dense with medical terminology and coverage percentages that blurred together until he found the dependent care section. 100% coverage for diagnostic services, hospitalizations, specialist consultations, surgical procedures. The kind of safety net he'd assumed was reserved for executives, not senior analysts. His phone buzzed. Brandon calling, probably wondering where he was or needing code review. James let it go to voicemail. The counseling services page listed 5 therapists in the Atlanta area who specialized in grief and single parenthood, all accepting new patients, all covered fully under the company plan. He'd been carrying the weight of Jennifer's death alone for 3 years because therapy felt like an indulgence he couldn't afford on time or money, but here it was, available and waiting for him to simply reach out. "Daddy, are you reading boring grown-up stuff?" Emma looked up from her drawing, which appeared to be their apartment building rendered in purple crayon with stick figures in every window. "Kind of. It's about how work is going to help us more. Does that mean you won't be so tired?" Her question carried weight beyond its simple construction. "Because sometimes you fall asleep when we're reading bedtime stories and I have to poke you awake." The observation landed like an indictment James couldn't dispute. How many nights had he started a story only to drift off mid-sentence, Emma's voice pulling him back to consciousness 3 pages later? "Yeah, Bug, that's exactly what it means. I'm going to be less tired from now on." "Good." Emma returned to her drawing. "The boss lady was nice. She has sad eyes like you do sometimes." James studied his daughter, this small oracle who saw things adults worked hard to hide. Sad eyes. He'd never thought of Patricia that way, but Emma was right. Beneath the professional competence and the CEO authority, there was something wounded in Patricia that recognized its mirror in him. The rest of the morning unfolded with unusual ease. They went to Riverside Park, where Emma ran herself breathless on the playground while James sat on a bench and simply watched instead of using the time to answer emails or plan the next crisis response. Other parents dotted the playground, mostly mothers at this hour, giving him curious glances that he'd learned to ignore over 3 years of being the only dad at pickup and drop-off. A woman around Patricia's age approached, her toddler clinging to her leg. "Hooky day?" She smiled with the easy camaraderie of shared rebellion. "Something like that. My daughter's school has a field trip I forgot to sign permission for." "I've done that 3 times this year." She laughed without judgment. "I'm Rachel, and this is Marcus. We're here because I completely forgot about a dentist appointment, and we're killing time until the rescheduled slot." The normalization of parental failure felt like absolution. James introduced himself and Emma, and they fell into the kind of surface conversation that parks facilitated: schools, neighborhoods, the eternal struggle of kid-friendly restaurants. Rachel's presence reminded him that he'd been isolating, turning down the few social invitations that came his way because anything beyond work and Emma felt impossible to sustain. When Emma finally wore herself out, they walked home through streets James usually only saw from his car during the morning rush. The neighborhood looked different at 11 on a Friday, shops open and people moving at human speed instead of commuter velocity. He'd been living in this area for 3 years and had never noticed the bookstore on the corner or the coffee shop with outdoor seating. Back at the apartment, Emma went down for a nap without protest, exhausted from playground freedom. James pulled out his phone and stared at the counseling services list. Dr. Margaret Foster's office was 3 blocks from Cole Technologies, convenient for lunch hour appointments. Her bio mentioned specialization in complicated grief and family restructuring. The phrase felt clinical for what he was living, but accurate enough. He called before he could talk himself out of it. The receptionist who answered had a voice designed for crisis management, warm but efficient. She had an opening Tuesday at noon. James took it and hung up before the magnitude of what he'd just committed to could overwhelm him. His phone buzzed again. Brandon, persistent. James answered this time. "Where are you? Patricia said you were taking today off but didn't say why, and everyone's assuming the worst after you missed the gala." Brandon's voice carried genuine worry beneath the professional concern. "I'm home. Emma's school thing came up." The lie came easily, practiced from months of manufacturing acceptable excuses. But then he caught himself, remembering Patricia's words about honesty. "Actually, that's not true. Patricia told me to take the day. I've been burning out and she noticed before I did." Silence on the other end, long enough that James checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Brandon spoke carefully, like approaching something fragile. "That makes sense. You've been running pretty hard since I started here 6 months ago. I figured that was just your baseline." The admission stung because it meant James's burnout had been visible to everyone except himself. He'd thought he was hiding it, maintaining professional competence while falling apart internally, but apparently the cracks showed more than he'd realized. "Yeah, well, I'm working on that. Look, if you need code review or have questions about the Phoenix integration, send them over and I'll look when Emma goes down for her nap, but I'm not coming in today." "Actually," Brandon hesitated, "Patricia sent an email this morning. She's reassigning 30% of your current workload to me and Keisha. Said it's permanent restructuring, not temporary. I wanted to check with you before I started touching anything." The news should have brought relief, but what James felt instead was territorial panic. Those were his projects, his code, his responsibility. Letting go meant trusting other people to maintain standards, and trust required faith he'd spent 3 years depleting. "Which modules?" He pulled up his laptop, already mentally cataloging what could be delegated and what couldn't. "James," Brandon's tone shifted, firmer now. "Patricia was clear. This isn't optional, and you don't get veto power. She wants me to handle the client dashboard redesign and the API documentation. Keisha's taking over the automated testing framework. You keep Phoenix and the security audit, but everything else gets distributed." The reality of what Patricia had meant by structural change settled over James like a weighted blanket. This wasn't just about him working fewer hours. This was about dismantling the one-man department he'd built through refusal to delegate, the control structure that had let him feel indispensable while running himself into dust. "Okay." The word came out strangled. "Okay, just give me the weekend to do handoff documentation. I can't just dump projects on you without context. Patricia said you'd say that. She also said to tell you no. Keisha and I are supposed to figure it out ourselves, and if we hit problems, we ask you questions. That's the whole point, teaching us to solve things instead of always coming to you for answers." James closed his laptop harder than necessary. The logical part of his brain understood the strategy. The terrified part that had been white-knuckling control for 3 years wanted to drive to the office immediately and protect his territory. But he'd promised Patricia he'd try, and trying meant sitting with the discomfort of letting go. "Fine, but when the client complains that the dashboard doesn't match specifications, that's on you." "Noted." Brandon's voice carried a smile. "For what it's worth, I'm glad Patricia's making you slow down. You're brilliant at this work, but you've been operating like someone who thinks sleep is optional. It's good you're finally getting support." They ended the call with the awkward friendliness of colleagues who didn't quite know how to be human with each other outside project discussions. James sat in his living room, laptop closed, and confronted the strange emptiness of a Friday afternoon with nothing demanding his immediate attention. No fires to put out, no deadlines screaming, just hours stretching ahead that belonged to him and Emma. He should feel relieved. Instead, he felt untethered, like someone had cut the ropes holding him in place, and now he was drifting without direction. Work had been his anchor, the one area where he maintained competence and control while the rest of his life spun in chaos. Reducing his hours meant confronting all the space he'd been filling with productivity, all the feelings he'd been outrunning through constant motion. The counseling appointment suddenly felt more necessary and more terrifying. What would he even say to Dr. Foster? That he'd been using work as a shield against grief? That he'd forgotten how to exist as anything beyond father and employee? That Patricia's intervention had cracked open something in him that he didn't know how to process? Emma woke from her nap cranky and disoriented, the way she always did when sleep caught her off guard. James made her a snack and turned on her favorite show, then returned to Patricia's folder. The Parents Network information included a contact list, 12 other single parents at Cole Technologies, most of them women, all of them navigating the same impossible mathematics of full-time work and full-time parenting. He'd seen some of them at company events, always rushed and apologizing for kids in tow, but had never thought to connect beyond polite nods. One name jumped out, Marcus Young, Brandon's dad, who had a daughter Emma's age. James vaguely remembered Brandon mentioning weekend custody arrangements, the careful choreography of shared parenting. He drafted a text before overthinking could stop him, asking if Marcus wanted to coordinate a playdate for the girls. The response came back within minutes. Yes, absolutely. How about tomorrow at the park? Small victories, Patricia would probably call them. James was learning to call them survival tactics, tiny threads of connection that might weave into something resembling a support system if he didn't yank them apart through pride or isolation. Friday evening found them at the kitchen table again, Emma working on actual homework this time while James made dinner that didn't come from a box or takeout container. He'd forgotten he knew how to cook, that Jennifer had taught him her jerk chicken recipe, and he'd written it down in the margins of a cookbook they'd received as a wedding gift. Finding the recipe card in Jennifer's handwriting felt like archaeological discovery, proof of a version of himself that had existed before grief rewrote his personality. The chicken wouldn't win awards, but Emma declared it almost as good as Mommy's, which was the highest praise his daughter knew how to give. They ate slowly, talking about the weekend ahead, and James felt muscles he didn't know he'd been clenching finally start to release. After Emma went to bed, James found himself staring at his phone, Patricia's number in his recent calls. He wanted to tell her that he'd taken the day, that he'd made the therapy appointment, that he was trying to believe her promise that slowing down wouldn't mean everything collapsed. But reaching out felt presumptuous, like assuming their conversation last night had created some relationship beyond professional obligation. He compromised by sending an email, brief, professional, thanking her for the resources and confirming he'd reviewed everything. Her response came 30 minutes later, long past when CEOs should be checking work email on Friday nights. Just 3 words, proud of you. The simplicity of it hit James harder than paragraphs would have. Proud. When was the last time someone had said that to him about something other than code delivery? Jennifer used to say it constantly, casual affirmations that he'd learned not to hear because they came so easily. But Patricia's pride carried weight earned through understanding what it cost him to accept help, to admit he'd been drowning. James fell asleep that night without the laptop beside him, without checking email one last time, without mentally rehearsing Monday's meetings. The quiet felt foreign enough to wake him twice, his brain searching for the crisis that must exist if he wasn't actively managing it. But the apartment stayed peaceful, Emma breathing steady in the next room, and eventually James's body remembered that rest was allowed. Saturday morning brought the playdate with Marcus and his daughter Zoe, a whirlwind of energy who had Emma running circles around the playground within 5 minutes. Marcus turned out to be 42, a project manager at Cole Technologies who'd been divorced for 2 years and navigated single fatherhood with the kind of competence James was still building toward. Brandon mentioned Patricia staged an intervention with you. Marcus sat on the bench beside James, watching their daughters conquer the jungle gym. She did the same thing for me last year when my ex tried to change custody arrangements and I was working 70-hour weeks trying to afford better lawyers. Showed up at my desk with the Employee Assistance Program paperwork and told me the company would cover legal fees if I agreed to therapy and reasonable hours. The revelation shifted James's understanding of Thursday night again. Patricia hadn't invented this approach for him. This was her pattern, her method of managing the human cost of corporate ambition. How many other employees had she pulled back from the edge? Does it work? The therapy, the reduced hours? James needed to hear from someone who'd walked this path and survived. Marcus considered the question with the gravity it deserved. It's not magic. I still fuck up. I still forget permission slips and feed Zoe cereal for dinner more often than a good parent should. But I'm not drowning anymore. I can actually think past the next crisis. And Zoe seems happier, which matters more than me being some perfect Pinterest parent. They fell into easy conversation, trading war stories about school bureaucracy and the endless churn of kids outgrowing clothes. Marcus mentioned the Parents Network monthly dinners, asked if James wanted to join next week. The invitation came without pressure, just an open door James could walk through if isolation stopped feeling safer than connection. By the time they left the park, James had Marcus's number saved and plans for another playdate the following weekend. Emma chattered about Zoe all the way home, already planning elaborate games for their next meeting. Watching his daughter make friends reminded James that his isolation had been bleeding into her life too, limiting her world because he'd been too buried to facilitate normal childhood socialization. Sunday passed in the kind of domestic mundanity James had forgotten could exist. Laundry, grocery shopping, Emma's bath time without the underlying urgency of Monday morning approaching like a deadline. He read 3 chapters of the grief book Patricia had left marked in her folder, recognizing himself uncomfortably in the description of complicated mourning, the way some people got stuck in the productivity phase because staying busy meant never confronting the loss directly. Monday morning arrived with the old familiar anxiety, but James forced himself to follow through on the changes Patricia had mandated. He dropped Emma at school on time without rushing. He ate breakfast sitting down. He arrived at the office at 8:30 instead of 7, walking past his usual parking spot to find one closer to the building entrance because why was he always making everything harder than necessary? Brandon and Keisha had already started the handoff projects, working in a conference room with whiteboards covered in architecture diagrams. They waved when James passed but didn't pull him in, respecting the boundaries Patricia had established. The restraint probably killed Brandon, who asked questions like breathing, but he was learning the same lesson James was, that some problems required figuring out instead of asking. Patricia's assistant intercepted James before he reached his office, redirecting him to the executive floor. Walking into Patricia's domain at 8:45 on a Monday felt surreal, like crossing into territory reserved for people whose problems mattered more than code deployment. Patricia looked up from her laptop when he entered, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. She'd traded the gala dress for her standard work uniform, tailored suit, minimal jewelry, the kind of professional armor that announced competence before she opened her mouth. "How was the weekend?" No preamble, no corporate small talk. "Different." James settled into the chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "I took Emma to the park, met up with Marcus and his daughter, made an appointment with Dr. Foster for Tuesday, didn't check email once on Saturday." Patricia's expression shifted into something that might have been approval or might have been relief. "Good. And the workload redistribution? I know letting go isn't your strength." "Brandon said you told him I don't get veto power." James couldn't quite keep the edge from his voice. "That feels less like support and more like having my authority undermined." "Your authority was never the issue. Your inability to delegate was." Patricia leaned back, and the motion felt calculated rather than casual. "You're brilliant at the technical work, James, but you've built a system where nothing moves without your direct involvement, which means your capacity becomes the bottleneck for the entire department. That's not sustainable for you, and it's not fair to Brandon and Keisha, who need room to grow into their potential." The logic was sound enough to be infuriating. James wanted to argue, to defend his methods, but the defense would require claiming he'd been managing fine when Thursday night had proven otherwise. So what's the plan? I show up, collect a paycheck, and watch other people do my job? Patricia's eyes sharpened. No. You show up rested enough to do your actual job, which is leading the technical architecture for our highest value projects. You mentor Brandon and Keisha instead of doing their work for them. You contribute at the level we're paying you for instead of burning yourself out on tasks that should live 2 levels down the org chart. She pulled a document from her desk drawer and slid it across to him. CTO, Chief Technology Officer, printed across the top in bold letters, his name underneath, effective date 3 weeks out. James stared at the paper like it might spontaneously combust. CTO. The position didn't currently exist at Cole Technologies. Creating it meant board approval, budget allocation, a complete restructuring of how the technical organization reported up through leadership. I don't understand. His voice came out smaller than intended. I missed a gala and had a breakdown in my kitchen. That's not typically the path to executive promotion. You're right, it's not. Patricia's expression turned serious. But here's what happened while you were drowning. You delivered the Phoenix project 8 weeks early and 40% under budget. You identified a security vulnerability that could have cost us millions in breach damages. You built automated systems that cut our deployment time by 60%. And you did all of that while being the sole technical escalation point for 37 different projects because you refused to trust anyone else with critical decisions. She leaned forward, holding his gaze. The board has been asking me for 6 months why we don't have a CTO. I've been telling them we needed to grow someone into the role, and you've been the obvious candidate since last year. But I couldn't promote you when you were already working yourself to death at the senior analyst level. So I've been trying to get you to slow down, to accept support, to build the foundation that would let you take on executive responsibility without it killing you. The pieces clicked into place with uncomfortable precision. Thursday night hadn't been intervention as crisis response. It had been intervention as prerequisite, Patricia clearing the obstacles that stood between James and a promotion he'd been too buried to see coming. And if I refused the position? He needed to understand his options, even though the question felt rhetorical. Then I promote someone else and you stay exactly where you are, which would be a waste of your talent and the company's investment in your development. Patricia's tone made clear this wasn't a threat, just factual assessment. But I don't think you'll refuse. I think you're scared of accepting because it means admitting you're worth more than you've been allowing yourself to believe. The words landed with surgical accuracy. James had been living in survival mode so long that ambition felt like luxury, like something reserved for people whose personal lives weren't held together with duct tape and force of will. But Patricia was offering him more than promotion. She was offering validation that he was capable of growth even while carrying grief. There's a condition. Patricia's voice shifted, carrying weight that made James's attention sharpen. Robert Harrison is our current COO. He's been pushing to outsource the entire technical department to his brother Stephen's consulting firm. The board has been resisting, but Robert's built enough political capital that they're considering it as a cost-saving measure. I need someone in the CTO role who can't be bought, who'll fight for the team instead of selling them out for kickbacks and quarterly bonuses. The scope of what she was describing settled over James like a weighted vest. This wasn't just promotion. This was Patricia recruiting him as an ally in internal warfare, trusting him with information that could detonate if it reached the wrong ears. Why me? If you know Robert's corrupt, why not just fire him? Because I don't have proof yet, just patterns and instinct and 20 years of learning to spot corporate psychopaths. Patricia's frustration bled through her professional composure. Robert was my fiancé before he was my COO. I know how he operates. Legal enough to survive scrutiny, unethical enough to maximize personal profit. He's been here 18 months, and in that time our outsourcing costs have tripled, while our internal technical capacity has stayed flat. Either we're terrible at hiring, or someone's creating dependency on external firms that happen to pay referral fees. James absorbed the revelation, recalibrating everything he thought he understood about office politics. Robert Harrison had always been pleasant in their limited interactions, the kind of executive who remembered names and asked about families. But Patricia was describing something darker beneath the surface charm. "What do you need from me?" "Accept the CTO position. Build the case for keeping technical work in-house. Watch the numbers and flag anything that doesn't make sense." Patricia held his gaze. "And understand that doing this might cost you Robert's goodwill, which he'll weaponize however he can. He's already started asking questions about why you're getting special accommodations, why your health plan was upgraded, why I personally intervened when you missed the gala." The threat crystallized into something concrete. James had assumed Thursday night was private, a conversation between boss and employee that stayed contained. But apparently Robert was already gathering ammunition, building a narrative that could destroy both James's career and Patricia's credibility. "He thinks we're having an affair." James said it as statement rather than question, watching Patricia's face confirm what he'd guessed. "That's why he's tracking my health benefits and your visits to my apartment. He's going to suggest it to the board if you accept the CTO position. He'll frame it as favoritism, as me creating a fake executive role to justify inappropriate relationship with a subordinate." Patricia's voice stayed level, but James caught the tension underneath. "I need you to understand what you're walking into. This isn't just professional advancement. This is choosing sides in a fight that could get ugly fast." James thought about Emma's surgery fund, the $180,000 waiting in his future like a financial guillotine. He thought about the executive health plan that would cover her treatment completely, the security that came with higher salary and better benefits. He thought about Robert Harrison's polished smile and the calculation behind it, the kind of corruption that dressed itself in business casual and called destruction restructuring. "I accept." The words came out steady, surprising him with their certainty. "I accept the position, and I accept the fight that comes with it. But I need one thing from you." Patricia raised an eyebrow, waiting. "If this blows up, if Robert successfully makes this about us instead of about his corruption, you don't protect me at the cost of your position. Emma needs the health coverage, but she needs it through legitimate channels, not through you falling on your sword to save my reputation." Something shifted in Patricia's expression, softening into what might have been respect or might have been recognition. "Deal. But you should know, I don't plan on losing to Robert Harrison. I didn't build this company to watch it get carved up and sold to the highest bidder." They shook on it, and the formality of the gesture felt appropriate for the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to. James left Patricia's office with a promotion letter in his hand and the uncomfortable awareness that he'd just volunteered for warfare he didn't fully understand. But Patricia had looked at him like she believed he could handle it, like his competence extended beyond code into strategy, and maybe that belief was worth the risk. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of transition meetings and handoff documentation. Brandon peppered him with questions that James forced himself to answer with guidance instead of solutions, teaching the younger analyst to think through problems instead of just implementing fixes. It went against every instinct James had built over 3 years of being the sole answer keeper, but he could see Brandon's confidence growing with each figured-out solution. Tuesday brought his first appointment with Dr. Foster, whose office occupied the second floor of a medical building 3 blocks from work. The waiting room held the standard fare: outdated magazines, abstract art chosen for its complete absence of meaning, chairs designed for temporary occupation. James filled out intake paperwork that asked questions he didn't know how to answer. How would you rate your current stress level? What brought you to therapy today? Have you experienced thoughts of self-harm? Dr. Foster turned out to be younger than her credentials suggested, maybe 45, with kind eyes and the kind of steady presence that probably put most patients at ease. James sat across from her in an office that managed to feel both professional and warm, and tried to explain 3 years of grief in 50-minute increments. "My wife died of breast cancer when our daughter was 3. I've been managing fine, better than fine actually. I kept working, kept Emma in school, kept everything running. But apparently I've been running myself into the ground without noticing, and my boss staged an intervention that I'm still processing." "Doctor." Foster took notes but never broke eye contact. a skill that made James feel both seen and exposed. "Tell me about the intervention." So he did. Thursday night, Patricia's knock, the firing that wasn't firing, the revelation that he'd been mistaking survival for functioning. Dr. Foster listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that pushed him toward insights he'd been avoiding. "It sounds like you've been using productivity as a shield against grief. Work became a socially acceptable way to avoid processing your loss, because people reward busy and punish vulnerable." She paused, letting the observation settle. "What happens if you slow down, James? What are you afraid you'll find?" The question cracked something open that James had been keeping sealed. What was he afraid of? That slowing down meant facing how much he missed Jennifer, how much he resented her for dying and leaving him alone with a 3-year-old and no roadmap for survival. That admitting he needed help meant proving he wasn't capable of handling what she'd managed while fighting cancer. That if he stopped moving long enough to feel the grief fully, it would swallow him whole and Emma would lose both parents. "I'm afraid I'll fall apart and never manage to put myself back together." The words came out raw. "I'm afraid Emma will see me break and lose the one parent she has left. I'm afraid that if I admit I can't do this alone, it means Jennifer was stronger than me, and I couldn't measure up." Dr. Foster leaned forward slightly. "James, your wife fought cancer while raising a toddler. That's not a standard you should be measuring yourself against. That's a crisis situation where she found strength because she had to, not because she was inherently more capable than you are. And from what you've described, you've been doing exactly the same thing, finding strength in crisis mode because you had to. The question now is whether you're ready to live instead of just survive." The therapy session ended with homework, journal prompts about what living might look like compared to surviving, permission to feel anger at Jennifer for dying, and instructions to schedule next week's appointment before leaving. James walked back to the office feeling scraped raw and somehow lighter, like Dr. Foster had lanced something that had been festering below the surface. Wednesday brought Robert Harrison to James's office with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and questions wrapped in corporate friendliness. "Heard congratulations are in order. CTO is a big step up from senior analyst." James kept his expression neutral, years of professional poker face serving him well. Patricia mentioned the board approved the position. "I'm looking forward to the new challenges." "I bet you are." Robert leaned against the doorframe, casual in a way that felt calculated. "Quick promotion, though. Almost makes you wonder what you did to earn it beyond the Phoenix project. But then Patricia's always had a soft spot for dedicated employees." The insinuation hung in the air like smoke. James met Robert's gaze directly, refusing to flinch. "The Phoenix project exceeded every metric by significant margins. Patricia rewards results. That's why the company's grown 300% under her leadership." Robert's smile sharpened. "Of course, results. That's definitely all this is about." He straightened, adjusting his cuffs in a gesture that screamed old money and entitlement. "Word of advice, though, James, executive positions come with scrutiny. Board members pay attention to who gets promoted and why. You'll want to make sure your personal life doesn't create optics problems that undermine your professional credibility." The threat couldn't have been clearer if Robert had written it down and signed it. James felt anger spike hot through his chest, but he forced his voice to stay level. "My personal life is raising my daughter and doing exceptional work. If the board has concerns about my qualifications, they're welcome to review the metrics. I'm confident they'll find everything they need." Robert held his gaze for a beat too long, then smiled that empty smile again. "I'm sure they will. Welcome to the executive team, James. I look forward to working closely with you." He left, and James sat in his office processing the encounter. So this was how it would go. Veiled insinuations and reputation attacks, Robert building a narrative that turned Patricia's support into scandal and James's competence into fraud. The promotion hadn't even been officially announced yet, and the warfare had already begun. James pulled up his email and found a message from Patricia sent 20 minutes earlier. Subject line, "Board meeting Thursday 2 p.m. Body text, "Robert requested emergency session to discuss Concerns about recent personnel decisions. Come prepared to defend your qualifications. Bring metrics. So much for a gentle transition into executive responsibility. James spent the rest of Wednesday pulling together every project deliverable, every client testimonial, every quantifiable measure of his technical contribution. If Robert wanted to question his credentials publicly, James would bury him in evidence that competence wasn't negotiable or gender-specific or dependent on who you knew. Thursday morning, Emma woke up coughing, the same dry hack she'd had the previous week. James made a mental note to call Dr. Foster, the pediatrician, not the therapist, and get her checked out properly instead of assuming it would pass. The executive health plan meant he could actually make appointments without calculating whether Emma's symptoms justified the copay. He dropped her at school with instructions for the nurse to call if the cough worsened, then drove to Cole Technologies with the kind of focused determination he usually reserved for impossible deadlines. The board meeting loomed at 2 p.m., 3 hours away, plenty of time to rehearse his defense and remind himself that he'd earned this promotion through work that spoke for itself. Brandon caught him in the hallway at noon, looking worried. "Robert's been asking me questions about your workload, whether you've seemed stressed, if Patricia's been giving you preferential treatment. I didn't tell him anything, but I thought you should know he's building a case." The loyalty surprised James more than the warning. He and Brandon had worked together for months without developing much beyond professional courtesy, but apparently solidarity ran deeper than he'd realized. "Thanks for the heads up. Let me know if he pushes harder." At 1:45 p.m., James headed to the boardroom with his laptop and a flash drive containing 3 years of performance documentation. Patricia was already there, along with 6 board members including Nancy Brooks, who chaired the board and carried the kind of authority that made even Patricia defer to her judgment. Robert arrived last, positioning himself strategically at the opposite end of the table from Patricia, creating visual distance that suggested opposing sides. Nancy called the meeting to order with brisk efficiency. Robert requested this session to discuss concerns about the newly created CTO position and its assignment to James Mitchell. "Robert, you have the floor." Robert stood, because of course he did, using physical presence to command attention. "Thank you, Nancy. I want to be clear that my concerns are purely about process and optics, not about James's technical abilities, which are clearly strong. However, I think we need to examine whether creating an executive position specifically for one person, particularly when that person has been receiving unusual accommodations and direct intervention from our CEO, creates appearance problems that could expose the company to litigation risk." He pulled up a PowerPoint, because Robert Harrison would never make allegations without visual aids, showing timeline graphics that correlated Patricia's visits to James's apartment with health plan upgrades and the CTO position creation. The presentation was professionally done, insinuation dressed up as risk analysis, suggesting impropriety without making direct accusations. "I'm not saying anything inappropriate is happening. I'm saying it looks questionable, and in today's environment, appearance matters as much as reality. We have other senior technical staff who might view this promotion as favoritism rather than merit-based advancement. We have shareholders who might question whether executive decisions are being made for sound business reasons or personal ones." Robert sat down, having lobbed his grenade into the middle of the table disguised as concerned corporate governance. James felt his pulse spike but kept his expression neutral, waiting for his turn. Nancy turned to Patricia. "Do you want to respond?" Patricia stood, and the movement carried coiled tension. "Yes." Robert's presentation deliberately excludes context to build a narrative that serves his agenda rather than the company's interests. "Let me provide the missing information." She pulled up her own presentation, and James recognized Patricia's signature style, data-heavy, ruthlessly organized, designed to evaporate speculation with facts. James Mitchell has been the technical lead on 17 major projects over the past 4 years. 15 delivered early or on time. 14 came in under budget. Client satisfaction scores average 4.8 out of 5. His code review approval rate is 97%. These aren't opinions. These are measurable outcomes that demonstrate exceptional competence. The next slide showed org chart analysis. We currently have 37 active technical projects with a technical leadership team of 1, James. That's unsustainable from a business continuity standpoint and creates unacceptable key person risk. Creating the CTO position isn't favoritism, it's basic organizational health, and frankly, we should have done it 2 years ago. Patricia advanced to the next slide and James felt his stomach drop. She'd included screenshots of Robert's emails with Stephen Harrison, his brother, discussing outsourcing contracts and referral fees. Not enough to prove corruption definitively, but enough to establish pattern and motive. As for Robert's concerns about optics, I find it interesting that he's suddenly worried about appearance of impropriety while simultaneously negotiating contracts that would funnel company work to his brother's firm at rates 30% above market value. Maybe we should discuss which situations actually create litigation risk. The room went silent. Robert's face flushed dark, anger breaking through his polished composure. You're deflecting. This meeting is about your questionable judgment regarding James Mitchell, not about standard consulting agreements. Nancy held up a hand, cutting off Robert's response. Let's hear from Mr. Mitchell directly. James, do you want to address Robert's concerns? James stood, grateful for the 3 years of client presentations that had taught him to speak with authority even when his hands were shaking. I appreciate Robert's attention to optics, even if I don't appreciate the insinuation behind it. So let me be very clear about facts. He pulled up his first slide. Emma's medical records, diagnosis date, estimated surgery costs. 3 weeks ago, I found out my 6-year-old daughter has a heart condition that requires surgical intervention. The estimated cost is $180,000. Our standard company health plan would have covered roughly 60%, leaving me with $72,000 in out-of-pocket expenses I don't have. Next slide. His own performance metrics, matching what Patricia had shown, but with additional granularity. Patricia upgraded my health plan to executive coverage as part of offering me the CTO position. That coverage will save my daughter's life. If the board wants to characterize that as favoritism, you're welcome to. I call it basic human decency from a CEO who noticed an employee drowning and threw a life preserver. He advanced to the final slide, 3 years of escalating work hours pulled from his laptop logs, showing the pattern of unsustainable behavior Patricia had been trying to interrupt. As for special accommodations, yes, Patricia mandated that I reduce my work hours and accept support. Why? Because I was working 80-hour weeks while being a single father, and I was heading for either a breakdown or a heart attack. The accommodation wasn't preferential treatment. It was intervention to prevent the company from losing a high-performing employee to completely preventable burnout. James sat down, his heart hammering, but his voice steady throughout. He'd laid everything bare. Emma's illness, his own struggles, the desperation that had been driving him, and turned Robert's insinuation into a referendum on whether the board cared about employees as humans or just as productivity units. Nancy looked at Robert with an expression that could freeze nitrogen. Mr. Harrison, do you have evidence of actual impropriety, or are you simply uncomfortable with a CEO who treats employees like they have lives outside the office? Robert's jaw worked, but he'd been outmaneuvered and knew it. Pressing the affair narrative now would make him look callous about a sick child and a grieving father. I withdraw my concerns. Clearly there's more context than I was aware of. The capitulation came through gritted teeth, and James recognized it for what it was: tactical retreat, not surrender. Robert would regroup and attack from a different angle, but for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Nancy addressed the full board. Unless anyone else has concerns about the CTO position or Mr. Mitchell's qualifications, I'd like to call a vote on formally approving the role and appointment. 6 hands went up in favor, Robert abstaining rather than voting against and looking worse. Motion carries. James, congratulations. You've earned this position through exceptional work, and I hope we can support you in balancing your professional and personal responsibilities. The meeting adjourned, board members filtering out with careful neutrality that suggested they'd formed opinions but weren't ready to declare them publicly. Patricia caught James's eye across the table, and something passed between them that felt like mutual recognition. They'd survived round 1. but the war was far from over. Robert left last, pausing at the door just long enough to make sure James saw his expression. The polite mask had dropped completely, revealing raw anger beneath. "This isn't over." He didn't wait for a response, which was fortunate because James didn't have one that wouldn't escalate the situation from professional tension into outright hostility. He gathered his laptop and notes, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and found Patricia waiting in the hallway. "You did well in there." The medical disclosure was risky but effective. James laughed, sharp and bitter. "I just told the board of directors that my kid needs surgery and I'm barely holding my life together. Not exactly the executive presence handbook recommendation." "No." Patricia's voice softened. "It's better. You showed them you're human and competent, which is a combination Robert can't compete with because he's only ever been the latter. He'll come at you again, but you've established credibility that'll be hard to undermine." They stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, and James felt the weight of everything that had shifted over the past week. 7 days ago, he'd been a senior analyst drowning in work and isolation. Now he was a CTO with a target on his back, a sick daughter who needed surgery, and a CEO who'd somehow become his ally in corporate warfare he still didn't fully understand. "I should get back to Emma. School ends in 20 minutes, and I promised I'd pick her up myself today instead of sending her to aftercare." Patricia nodded, but something flickered in her expression that made James pause. "Thank you for defending the position today, for trusting me with information about Robert. I know this is more than you signed up for." "Yeah, well," James shrugged, going for casual and landing somewhere near honest. "You knocked on my door at 9:47 p.m. to fire me from killing myself. Seems like the least I can do is help you stop Robert from killing the company." He left before the moment could get heavier, but Patricia's small smile followed him down the hallway and into the elevator. His phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Heard you crushed it in the board meeting. Drinks to celebrate?" And another from Marcus. "Playdate this weekend?" Zoe won't stop asking. Small threads of connection, weaving into something that might eventually resemble the support system Patricia kept insisting he needed. James drove to Emma's school feeling bruised and exhausted but somehow lighter, like he'd set down weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. The fight with Robert would continue. Emma's surgery loomed in the future. His grief over Jennifer hadn't magically resolved, but for the first time in 3 years, James allowed himself to believe that he didn't have to face any of it alone. Emma ran to the car when he pulled up, backpack bouncing, full of stories about her day that tumbled out faster than James could process. He listened anyway, really listened, and drove them home through Atlanta traffic without checking email at red lights or mentally rehearsing tomorrow's meetings. Just a father and daughter heading home on a Thursday afternoon, and maybe that was enough. 2 months dissolved into routine that felt almost foreign in its sustainability. James discovered his body remembered how to sleep 7 hours consecutively, that Emma could handle morning preparation with minimal supervision when he wasn't operating on fumes, that delegating work didn't equal professional suicide. Brandon and Keisha thrived with actual responsibility, solving problems James would have micromanaged into mediocrity 6 weeks earlier. The parents' network dinners became monthly anchors, rooms full of people who understood that loving your children and barely surviving parenthood weren't mutually exclusive states. Dr. Foster's office became Thursday ritual, 50 minutes of excavating grief James had buried under competence. Week 3, she'd asked what he was most angry about regarding Jennifer's death. Week 5, she'd made him write a letter to his dead wife, explaining why he'd been too afraid to date, too guilty to imagine moving forward. Week 7, she'd pointed out that treating work as memorial was insulting to both Jennifer's memory and his own capacity for growth. The observations hurt because they landed true, stripping away justifications he'd been hiding behind for 3 years. Emma's cough persisted despite 2 rounds of antibiotics and Dr. Margaret Foster's, the pediatrician, increasingly concerned expression. The referral to a pediatric cardiologist came with clinical language that barely masked worry. Appointment scheduled for October 15th. evaluation for the mitral valve prolapse that might require surgical intervention within 4 to 6 months. James added it to his calendar and tried not to calculate odds or worst-case scenarios, but the numbers haunted him anyway. $180,000. 6 months. 4 to 6 weeks recovery. Emma asking if she'd have a scar like the one in her Wonder Woman comic where Diana fought Ares and came back stronger. Patricia checked in weekly, brief conversations that stayed carefully professional while carrying undertones of something neither of them had vocabulary for yet. She asked about Emma's appointments, about James's therapy progress, about whether the workload felt manageable. He asked about board dynamics, about Robert's maneuvering, about the outsourcing proposals that kept appearing in quarterly reviews disguised as efficiency initiatives. They were building partnership, alliance, some third thing that existed in the space between boss and employee but hadn't crossed into territory that would validate Robert's insinuations. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the charity auction Cole Technologies held annually, black tie event at the Harrington Grand Hotel that James had successfully avoided for 3 consecutive years. This year, Patricia's assistant sent calendar invitation marked mandatory for executive team, dress code formal, +1s encouraged. James stared at the invitation for 20 minutes before texting Marcus to ask if trading Emma sitting duties counted as reasonable co-parenting or shameless exploitation of new friendship. Marcus responded with laughing emojis and confirmed Zoe would love an overnight guest. Finding formal wear proved harder than anticipated. James's suit from Jennifer's funeral hung in the closet, but wearing it felt like tempting fate, like dragging grief into an evening that required something lighter. He bought new clothes. First time in 3 years he'd spent money on himself instead of Emma or household necessities, and felt vaguely fraudulent trying on jackets that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. The salesperson kept calling him Sir and suggesting pocket squares, and James left with a charcoal suit that fit properly and the uncomfortable awareness that he was preparing for something beyond professional obligation. The night of the auction, Emma helped him tie his tie, her small fingers surprisingly competent at the Windsor knot she'd learned from YouTube videos. "You look fancy, Daddy, like when you married Mommy." The comparison should have hurt, but what James felt instead was gentle melancholy, the kind that acknowledged loss without drowning in it. "Your mom would have laughed at me trying to be fancy. She always said I looked uncomfortable in formal wear." "Do you miss her?" Emma asked it plainly, the way children asked everything, without the adult fear of painful answers. "Every day, Bug, but differently now than before. Less like drowning, more like remembering someone I'm grateful I got to know." Emma processed this with the gravity she brought to important subjects. "Ms. Patricia makes you smile different than you smile at me, like grown-up smiling instead of daddy smiling." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. James had been carefully not examining his interactions with Patricia, keeping everything categorized as professional alliance while ignoring the way his pulse jumped when her name appeared in his inbox. The way Thursday meetings with her felt less like work and more like something he anticipated beyond strategic necessity. "Ms. Patricia is my boss and my friend. Sometimes adults smile at their friends." "Okay." Emma accepted this with the easy trust of children who hadn't learned skepticism yet. "But if you want her to be more than friends, that's okay too. Mommy would want you to be happy, not just not sad." The wisdom hit James square in the chest, delivered in 6-year-old syntax that somehow captured truth Dr. Foster had been circling for weeks. Not sad wasn't the same as happy. Survival wasn't living. Jennifer would want him to build a life, not just maintain the memorial of their shared past. He arrived at the Harrington Grand just after 7, valet parking and chandelier lighting and the kind of orchestrated elegance that made James feel like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The ballroom held 200 people in evening wear, champagne glasses and auction paddles, and the low hum of networking disguised as socializing. Patricia stood near the stage in deep blue that made her skin luminous, directing staff and greeting major donors with the effortless authority that made people want to please her. Their eyes met across the room, and her professional smile shifted into something warmer, more personal. She excused herself from the conversation she'd been navigating and crossed the floor toward him, heels clicking against marble with decisive rhythm. "You came. You made it mandatory for executive team. Didn't seem optional." "I could have made exceptions." Patricia's gaze traveled over his new suit with approval that felt more intimate than professional assessment warranted. "But I'm glad you didn't ask for one." James gestured toward the auction displays, searching for safe territory. "What's the charity this year?" "Pediatric Cardiac Research and Family Support. Seemed appropriate given—" She stopped herself, but James understood the unfinished thought. Given Emma's diagnosis, given the way medical crisis had become the catalyst for everything that changed between them. "That's good. I should bid on something, contribute properly now that I'm making executive salary." They drifted toward the silent auction tables, examining offerings that ranged from practical to absurd. Weekend cabin rental at Whispering Pines in the North Georgia mountains, wine-tasting tour, season tickets to the Atlanta Symphony. James found himself studying the cabin listing, imagining Emma exploring hiking trails, searching for wildlife, experiencing childhood outside the constraints of city apartments and scheduled activities. "You should bid on it." Patricia's voice came from beside him, close enough that he caught her perfume, something subtle and expensive that suited her perfectly. "Emma would love the mountains." "Maybe." James picked up the bid sheet, saw current offer at $800, and wrote $900 in decisive script. First time he'd ever bid on anything at these events, first time he'd imagined a future beyond next week's crisis management. The live auction started at 8. Patricia on stage presenting items and encouraging competitive bidding with the same skill she used in board meetings. She was magnetic up there, commanding attention without seeming to demand it, and James caught himself watching her instead of the auction lots. When she announced the Innovation Awards, including the one he'd missed 2 months earlier, James felt heat creep up his neck, but Patricia glossed over his absence with practiced ease, crediting his Phoenix project work without dwelling on the gala he'd skipped. Robert Harrison sat 3 tables away, watching James with expression that mixed calculation with barely concealed hostility. He'd been quieter since the board meeting, his outsourcing proposals tabled pending further analysis, but quiet didn't mean defeated. James had learned enough about corporate warfare to recognize tactical patience when he saw it. Dinner arrived in courses that demanded more silverware than seemed reasonable, and James found himself seated at Patricia's table alongside board members and major investors. Nancy Brooks asked pointed questions about his technical roadmap, clearly evaluating whether the CTO position was justified by strategy or sentiment. James answered with the kind of detailed planning he'd been developing over the past 6 weeks, demonstrating that Patricia's faith in him wasn't misplaced. Between main course and dessert, the band started playing, jazz ensemble that filled the ballroom with sound designed for dancing. Couples drifted toward the floor, and James watched them with the detachment of someone who'd forgotten his body knew those movements. Jennifer had loved dancing, dragging him to weddings and hotel bars and their living room at midnight when Emma was asleep. She'd laughed at his stiffness, his self-consciousness, his tendency to count steps instead of feeling rhythm. But she'd also made him feel like dancing with her was the most natural thing in the world. "Dance with me." Patricia's voice interrupted his memory, her hand extended across the table, an invitation that wasn't quite request. James hesitated, aware of eyes watching, of Robert 3 tables over tracking every interaction for weaponization later. But refusing felt like letting fear win, like prioritizing Robert's judgment over the simple human desire to move in rhythm with someone who made his pulse quicken. He took Patricia's hand. The dance floor accepted them with the anonymity crowds provided, enough bodies moving that their partnership became just another element in the larger pattern. Patricia moved with the confidence she brought to everything, and James found himself matching her rhythm more easily than expected. Muscle memory from years of Jennifer's patient teaching, maybe, or just the way Patricia made him feel less self-conscious about occupying space. "I should warn you, I haven't done this since my wedding. Jennifer and I danced to Etta James. She stepped on my feet the entire time and laughed about it for years." Patricia's expression softened into something that acknowledged the weight of what he'd shared. "Then we'll take it slow. They moved in comfortable silence for half a song before James spoke again, needing to name what had been building between them for 8 weeks. "Thank you for firing me that night, for caring enough to notice I was drowning, for trusting me with the CTO role despite knowing it would paint a target on both our backs. You don't need to thank me for basic decency, James. Any good leader would have done the same. Would they?" James met her eyes, close enough now to see the vulnerability she usually kept hidden behind professional competence. "Because I've worked a lot of places before Cole Technologies, and nobody else noticed when I was falling apart. Nobody else knocked on my door at 9:47 p.m. because they couldn't watch me drown. That's not standard leadership. That's something more." Patricia's breath caught almost imperceptibly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying—" James paused, searching for words that captured truth without rushing past what they weren't ready for. "I'm saying that Simone would want me to live fully again, not just exist. Emma keeps reminding me that not sad isn't the same as happy, and I think she's right. And you make me feel something beyond survival, something I thought died with Jennifer but maybe just went dormant." The music swelled around them, and Patricia's grip tightened fractionally on his shoulder. "I don't want this to be an act, James. I don't want to pretend I'm just your boss or your mentor or your friend, when the truth is I think about you constantly in ways that have nothing to do with org charts and everything to do with the way you showed up for that board meeting and defended yourself with dignity I've rarely seen. But I also don't want to prove Robert right. Don't want to validate his narrative that this was about attraction instead of recognizing competence." James pulled back slightly, needing to see her face fully for what he was about to propose. "So we wait. We let me settle into the CTO role, let Emma get through her surgery, let enough time pass that nobody can claim the promotion was about anything except merit. And then, when the dust settles and Robert's moved on to other targets, we see if what we're feeling now survives reality." "That could take months." Patricia's voice carried frustration and relief in equal measure. "I've been widowed for 3 years. I've learned patience." James managed a smile that felt almost genuine. "And you're worth waiting for properly instead of rushing into something that gives Robert ammunition." Patricia nodded, accepting the logic even as something in her expression suggested she wanted to reject it entirely. The song ended, and they separated to polite applause distance, two professionals who'd shared a dance at a charity function, and nothing more observable than that. But James felt the shift between them, the acknowledgement that whatever they were building was real enough to protect, significant enough to require strategy instead of impulse. Robert intercepted James at the bar 20 minutes later, whiskey in hand and predatory smile firmly in place. "Enjoying yourself? You and Patricia looked very comfortable on the dance floor. We danced at a charity function. Is that grounds for HR complaint now?" James kept his tone neutral, refusing to give Robert the reaction he was fishing for. "Of course not. Just interesting timing, given your recent promotion and her very personal investment in your well-being." Robert swirled his drink, ice clicking against glass. "Word of advice: executive positions come with scrutiny beyond technical competence. Board members notice patterns. Investors ask questions. You might want to consider how your relationship with Patricia appears from the outside, especially if you want the CTO role to last beyond the honeymoon phase." The threat hung between them, barely veiled beneath corporate courtesy. James finished his water. He'd been carefully avoiding alcohol, too aware of how easily stress could become dependency, and met Robert's gaze directly. "My relationship with Patricia is professional respect between CEO and CTO. If the board has questions about my qualifications, they've had multiple opportunities to raise them. If investors are concerned about leadership decisions, they should examine the 300% growth Patricia's delivered over 7 years, instead of speculating about who danced with whom at a charity auction." Robert's smile hardened. "Naive. You think this is about qualifications? This is about optics and politics and the stories people tell about why things happen the way they do. You got promoted fast, James, unusually fast. And whether that promotion was earned or not, people will make assumptions. Smart executives manage those assumptions instead of pretending they don't exist." He left before James could formulate response, disappearing into the crowd with the casual arrogance of someone who believed he'd landed a meaningful blow. James stood at the bar processing the encounter, recognizing it for what it was. Robert establishing that the war was far from over, that he'd simply changed tactics from direct confrontation to death by 1,000 insinuations. Patricia found him 10 minutes later, reading tension in his posture with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to interpret his moods. Robert cornered you. He suggested my promotion creates optics problems that smart executives would manage better. Implied the board is asking questions about us. The board isn't asking questions. Robert's asking questions and pretending he's speaking for them. Patricia's frustration bled through her controlled exterior. He's been doing this for 18 months. Floating concerns as if they're consensus when really he's just manufacturing doubt. Ignore him. Hard to ignore someone actively building a case against my credibility. Patricia turned to face him fully, and something fierce flickered in her expression. Then we build a better case. We make your work so exceptional that nobody can question whether you earned this position. We document every win, every innovation, every metric that proves the CTO role was organizational necessity rather than personal favor. And we give Robert nothing. No private meetings, no personal texts, no ammunition he can twist into evidence of impropriety. The strategy made sense even as it hurt, establishing boundaries that protected them professionally while forcing distance personally. James nodded agreement, understanding the necessity while resenting it. The auction wrapped near midnight, James winning the cabin weekend with a final bid of $1,400 that felt simultaneously extravagant and essential. He drove home through empty Atlanta streets, replaying the evening in fragments, Patricia's hand in his on the dance floor, Emma's wisdom about not sad versus happy, Robert's thinly veiled threats, the acknowledgement that what he felt for Patricia was real enough to require protection instead of immediate gratification. Marcus returned Emma Sunday morning, both girls exhausted from a weekend of manufactured adventure and sugar consumption that would have made health-conscious parents weep. Emma fell asleep on the couch by noon, and James found himself staring at the cabin reservation confirmation, imagining a version of life where he could take his daughter to the mountains without it feeling like luxury he hadn't earned. Monday brought Emma's cardiology appointment at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, Dr. Margaret Foster examining test results with expression that transformed clinical detachment into genuine concern. The mitral valve prolapse was progressing faster than initial scans suggested. Surgery recommended within 8 to 10 weeks rather than 4 to 6 months. Recovery timeline extended to 6 weeks full restriction, another 6 weeks limited activity. Cost estimate revised upward to $200,000 because complications always cost more than projections. James sat in the consultation room absorbing information that rearranged his understanding of available time. 8 weeks. Thanksgiving, maybe early December. Emma's first-grade winter concert she'd been practicing for since September. The cabin trip he'd just won at auction. Every plan recalibrating around the new timeline, every assumption about available future dissolving into immediate crisis. The executive health plan covers this? His voice came out steady despite the fear churning underneath. 100%. Pre-authorization required, but given the diagnosis progression, approval should be straightforward. Dr. Foster's kindness made the clinical information slightly more bearable. Emma's young and otherwise healthy. Surgical outcomes for her age and condition profile are excellent. 97% success rate, minimal long-term impacts on quality of life, 97%. 3% margin for everything going wrong. For Emma joining Jennifer in whatever came after living. For James becoming the father who'd lost everyone. He focused on breathing, on the 77% success probability, on Dr. Foster's confidence instead of his own terror. Emma took the news with the resilience children brought to things adults made catastrophic. Surgery meant missing school, which was unfortunate, but also meant everyone signing her cast. She'd conflated heart surgery with broken bones in ways James didn't bother correcting because her optimism felt fragile enough without adding accuracy. She wanted to know if she'd have a scar, if it would be cool enough to show at lunch, if Miss Patricia would visit her in the hospital because Emma had decided Patricia was important to their family in ways James was still processing. He called Patricia from the hospital parking lot, needing to hear her voice before driving home to manufacture normalcy for Emma. She answered on the second ring despite the call coming mid-afternoon on a Monday. "James, how did the appointment go?" "Surgery in 8 weeks. Maybe sooner if a slot opens up. Recovery 12 weeks total. $200,000 that I don't have, but the insurance will cover." The words tumbled out faster than he could organize them. "She asked if you'd visit her in the hospital. I didn't know what to tell her." Patricia's silence lasted 3 heartbeats. "Of course I'll visit. James, do you need anything? Time off? Schedule flexibility? Someone to help coordinate logistics?" The offer wrapped around him like warmth, evidence that he didn't have to navigate this alone despite every instinct screaming that accepting help was weakness. "I need to not fall apart. I need to be the father Emma deserves instead of the terrified mess I actually am. I need—" He stopped, catching himself before the confession went somewhere that crossed professional lines they'd agreed to maintain. "You need to let people stand beside you while you figure out how to survive this." Patricia finished his thought with uncomfortable accuracy. "I'm here, James. Not as your boss, not as the CEO, just as someone who cares about you and Emma. Let me help." James closed his eyes against tears that threatened despite his best efforts at control. "Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you." They ended the call with logistics about schedule adjustments and project handoffs, retreating to professional territory because emotion felt too dangerous to sustain over phone connection. James drove home and made Emma dinner, helped with homework, read bedtime stories without falling asleep mid-page, and generally performed fatherhood with the mechanical competence of someone operating on autopilot. After Emma slept, he pulled out his laptop and drafted email to his team, Brandon, Keisha, the junior developers who'd been absorbed into the expanded technical organization, explaining that he'd need flexible schedule over the next several weeks for family medical situation. He kept it vague, professional, the kind of carefully worded transparency that acknowledged circumstance without demanding sympathy. Brandon responded within minutes despite the late hour, offering coverage for anything James needed to step back from temporarily or permanently. The next 6 weeks dissolved into controlled chaos. James maintained CTO responsibilities while preparing for Emma's surgery with the kind of obsessive planning Jennifer would have recognized. He researched pediatric cardiac surgeons until he could recite their success rates and complication statistics from memory. He coordinated with Emma's school about extended absence and makeup work. He packed hospital bags with comfort items, Peanut the elephant, Wonder Woman pajamas, the glow-in-the-dark stars Emma wanted for her hospital room ceiling, because stars meant Mommy could watch over the surgery from heaven. Patricia checked in daily, brief messages that asked about Emma, and offered support without overstepping boundaries they'd established. She sent flowers to Emma with a card that read, "Wonder Woman would be proud of your bravery," and made his daughter beam for 3 consecutive days. She rearranged board meetings so James could attend pre-surgery consultations. She existed in their lives as steady presence that Emma began expecting, and James stopped trying not to need. Robert continued his campaign of professional undermining with surgical precision. He questioned James's technical decisions in meetings, suggested the CTO role might be premature given James's personal distractions, floated outsourcing proposals disguised as efficiency initiatives. Nancy Brooks shut him down repeatedly, but Robert's persistence wore against morale like water against stone. 2 weeks before Emma's scheduled surgery, Robert struck with precision he'd clearly been building toward. Anonymous complaint filed with HR alleging inappropriate relationship between CEO and CTO, citing the dance at the charity auction, Patricia's visits to James's apartment, the health plan upgrade, and promotion timeline. HR Director Sarah Chen called James into her office with expression that mixed sympathy and obligation. "I have to investigate. It's my job, and anonymous complaints trigger mandatory review regardless of credibility." She slid the paperwork across her desk, single page that managed to make genuine concern look like scandal. "Walk me through your relationship with Patricia." James had prepared for this conversation since Robert's first insinuation, but preparation didn't make it less invasive. He explained Thursday night, Emma's diagnosis, the intervention that led to schedule changes and health benefits. He provided Dr. Foster's medical records proving the timeline, diagnosis after promotion discussions, not before. He pulled up email chains showing Patricia's support matched what she offered other employees facing family crisis, that he wasn't receiving preferential treatment beyond what the parents' network facilitated systematically. The dance at the auction? Sarah's question came gentle but necessary. One dance at a charity function where 50 other couples were also dancing. We're friends. We work together effectively. Neither of those things violates company policy. Sarah made notes with the kind of careful neutrality HR directors mastered. I need to talk to Patricia separately. This will take about a week to fully investigate, maybe less if the complaint is as baseless as it appears. Meanwhile, try not to worry. Anonymous complaints usually dissolve under scrutiny. James left her office feeling stripped raw despite the professional courtesy. Robert had succeeded in making James's relationship with Patricia into official investigation, into documentation that would exist in HR files regardless of outcome. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Even if the complaint was dismissed, it established pattern, created paper trail for future ammunition. He found Patricia in her office, already aware of the complaint because Sarah had notified her per protocol. She looked furious in ways that made James grateful he wasn't the target of that particular intensity. Roberts overplayed his hand. Sarah will dismiss this in 3 days once she reviews actual evidence instead of insinuation. But I'm sorry you have to deal with investigation on top of everything else. Patricia's anger carried protective edge that warmed James despite the circumstances. It's fine. I expected something like this after the board meeting. Robert doesn't accept defeat quietly. No, but he's about to learn I don't either. Patricia pulled up her laptop, fingers flying across keyboard with purpose. I've been building a case against him for 8 months. Email evidence of kickback negotiations with his brother's firm. Financial analysis showing our outsourcing costs tripled under his recommendations while quality declined. Testimony from 3 vendors who claim he solicited bribes disguised as consulting fees. I was waiting for board meeting next month to present everything, but I'm done waiting. The scope of what she was describing settled over James like revelation. Patricia hadn't just been defending him from Robert's attacks, she'd been systematically building Robert's destruction. When? James asked simply. Friday, emergency board meeting. I'll present evidence, call for immediate termination, and recommend forensic audit of every contract Robert touched in 18 months. Patricia's gaze met his directly. You should be there. As CTO, you have standing to speak about how his outsourcing push undermined technical organization. As the person he's been attacking, you deserve to watch him fall. Friday arrived heavy with anticipation. James tried to redirect toward Emma's pre-surgery appointments. Blood work came back clean. Final cardiac imaging showed the valve deterioration holding steady rather than accelerating. Anesthesia consultation confirmed Emma was excellent candidate for the procedure. Everything aligned for surgery scheduled 8 days out, December 4th, with recovery extending through Christmas and into the new year. The board meeting started at 2 p.m., same room where Robert had tried to destroy James's credibility 2 months earlier. The symmetry felt intentional. Patricia orchestrating Robert's downfall on the same stage where he'd launched his attack. Nancy Brooks called the meeting to order with expression that suggested she knew exactly what was coming and had already formed opinion. Patricia stood, and the movement carried coiled purpose. I'm calling for the immediate termination of Robert Harrison as COO and recommending the board approve forensic audit of all contracts and vendor relationships he managed during his tenure. She pulled up her presentation. Months of documentation organized with the ruthless efficiency Patricia brought to everything. Email threads showing Robert negotiating referral fees with his brother Stephen's consulting firm. Financial analysis demonstrating the outsourcing contracts Robert pushed delivered inferior results at premium prices. Vendor testimony about solicited bribes, kickback schemes, deliberate undermining of internal capabilities to create dependency on external firms. The evidence mounted slide by slide, damning in its specificity and volume. Robert sat frozen, face cycling through disbelief and rage and calculation as he realized how thoroughly Patricia had prepared his destruction. When she finished, silence held the room like physical presence. Nancy turned to Robert. "Do you want to respond to these allegations?" Robert stood, and James recognized the moment of decision playing across his face, fight or flight, denial or capitulation. He chose fight. "This is retaliation. Patricia's manufacturing evidence because I dared to question her inappropriate relationship with James Mitchell. Everything she's presenting is standard business practice reinterpreted through bias and vindictiveness. If the board wants to audit my decisions, I welcome the scrutiny. But let's also examine why Patricia is suddenly targeting me 2 months after I raised legitimate concerns about favoritism and ethical violations." The deflection was skilled, pivoting from Robert's corruption to Patricia's credibility in single motion. But Nancy wasn't buying it. "Mr. Harrison, 3 separate vendors have provided sworn statements about your solicitation of kickbacks. The email evidence includes messages from your corporate account. The financial analysis was conducted by external auditors Patricia hired specifically to avoid bias. This isn't retaliation. This is you getting caught." She turned to the full board. "All in favor of terminating Robert Harrison effective immediately and authorizing forensic audit of his activities?" 6 hands rose without hesitation. "Motion carries. Mr. Harrison, you're fired. Security will escort you out, and you can expect legal communication regarding the board's findings." Robert's face went through emotional journey that ended in cold fury directed at Patricia and James in equal measure. He stood, straightening his suit with the kind of dignity people clung to when everything else had been stripped away. "This isn't over. You think you've won? But all you've done is prove that ethics don't matter when you're sleeping your way to the top. That board meeting in 2 months, that was just foreplay. This," he gestured at the room with contempt, "this is the real scandal, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Security arrived before Robert could continue his exit monologue, escorting him from the boardroom with efficiency that suggested they'd been briefed on potential volatility. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled collectively. Nancy addressed Patricia directly. "Robert's allegations about your relationship with James, there's nothing to them?" Sarah Chen completed her investigation yesterday. "Anonymous complaint was baseless, filed by someone with clear agenda against both me and James. The report's in your inbox if you want to review it." Patricia's voice stayed level, professional, giving Nancy nothing beyond facts. "I've read it. Just wanted to hear directly from you." Nancy's gaze shifted to James. "Mr. Mitchell, are you confident you can continue as CTO after this situation with Robert?" James stood, channeling the confidence he'd found somewhere over the past 10 weeks. "Yes, Robert tried to undermine me because I represented threat to his corruption. But my work speaks for itself, and I'm committed to building the technical organization this company needs. I don't plan to let his vendetta define my tenure." Nancy nodded approval. "Good. Then let's move forward. Patricia, the audit will take approximately 6 weeks. Keep the board updated on findings." The meeting adjourned, board members filing out with the carefully neutral expressions that suggested they'd witnessed drama they'd rather not discuss directly. Patricia caught James's eye across the table, and something passed between them that felt like mutual survival, like recognition that they'd weathered the storm and remained standing. But James knew better than to celebrate yet. Robert's parting words hadn't been empty threat. He'd promised continued warfare, and men like Robert Harrison didn't accept defeat gracefully. The public termination would make him desperate, and desperate men did desperate things. The confirmation came 72 hours later. Robert filed lawsuit against Cole Technologies and Patricia personally, alleging wrongful termination, defamation, and discrimination. The lawsuit named James as co-defendant, claiming he'd conspired with Patricia to manufacture evidence and destroy Robert's reputation out of romantic jealousy and professional competition. The complaint was 30 pages of legal fiction presented as fact, designed to drag their names through discovery and depositions regardless of ultimate outcome. Patricia's lawyers assured her the case was frivolous, would likely be dismissed on summary judgment within 6 months. But 6 months meant 6 months of legal bills, media attention, and exactly the kind of scandal Robert had threatened. The lawsuit dropped the same day Emma's surgery was scheduled, because of course it did, because crisis never had the decency to arrive sequentially. James read the complaint in his car outside Children's Healthcare, hands shaking with rage and fear in equal measure. He was being sued for conspiracy to commit fraud, for defamation, for interfering with contractual relationships he'd barely known existed. The allegations were absurd, but absurdity didn't make them less dangerous to his reputation or his custody of Emma if Robert decided to expand the warfare into family court. Patricia called as he was processing the implications. "I'm sorry. I knew Robert would retaliate, but I didn't think he'd go nuclear this fast. My lawyers are confident we'll win, but it's going to be ugly before it's over." "Emma's surgery is tomorrow." James heard his voice crack despite best efforts at control. "I can't deal with lawsuit and surgery and recovery and keeping my job and pretending I'm a functional human being who has this handled." "Then don't pretend. Let me help. Let Marcus and the Parents Network help. Let your team cover for you at work. You don't have to carry everything alone, James. That's the whole point of what we've been building." She was right, but accepting felt like admitting defeat, like proving Robert's narrative that James was too weak to handle executive responsibility alongside personal crisis. But maybe that was exactly the kind of pride that had nearly destroyed him 3 months earlier, the refusal to ask for help disguised as strength. "Okay, yeah, I need help. I need someone to be at the hospital with me tomorrow because facing that alone feels impossible. I need someone to tell me Emma's going to survive this. I need—" He stopped, catching himself before the confession became something neither of them could walk back from. "I'll be there." Patricia's voice carried certainty that made James want to believe impossible things. "Surgery's scheduled for 7 a.m. I'll meet you at the hospital at 6. And James? Emma's going to be fine. She's strong like her father, brave like her mother. This is just one more thing she'll survive." The conviction in her voice wrapped around James like armor, and he let himself believe her because the alternative was drowning in terror he couldn't afford to indulge. December 4th arrived cold and clear, Atlanta winter that barely qualified as such but felt brutal anyway. Emma woke at 4 a.m., nervous energy making sleep impossible despite surgery requiring her to be rested. James made her laugh with stories about Mommy's terrible cooking before she got good at it, about the time Jennifer tried to make Thanksgiving turkey and ended up ordering Chinese food because the bird caught fire in an oven malfunction that became family legend. They arrived at Children's Healthcare at 5:30, and Patricia was already in the waiting room despite James telling her 6 would be fine. She'd brought coffee for him and hot chocolate for Emma, had somehow acquired a Wonder Woman coloring book and crayons that occupied Emma's attention through the endless pre-surgery paperwork. The surgical team took Emma back at 7 exactly, and the moment of separation carved something out of James's chest that hadn't fully healed from losing Jennifer. Emma waved at him from the gurney, brave despite the fear visible in her eyes, and James forced himself to smile like everything was fine instead of falling apart. Patricia's hand found his as soon as Emma disappeared behind surgical doors, and James gripped it like lifeline because pretending he didn't need the contact felt less important than surviving the next 4 hours. They sat in waiting room chairs designed for temporary discomfort, surrounded by other families facing their own medical crises, and Patricia didn't let go. "Tell me about Jennifer." Her request came quiet, barely audible above the ambient noise of hospital waiting. James talked about meeting Jennifer in college, her laugh that could fill entire rooms, the way she'd made him believe he was capable of more than he'd ever imagined, about the pregnancy that terrified and delighted them in equal measure, Emma's arrival that reorganized their understanding of love, about the diagnosis that came when Emma was 2, the treatment that bought them extra year together, the hospice weeks where Jennifer had made him promise to keep living after she was gone. "I didn't keep that promise for 3 years. I existed, functioned, checked boxes. But I wasn't living until you knocked on my door at 9:47 p.m. and told me I was fired from killing myself." Patricia's thumb traced patterns across his knuckles, unconscious comfort that felt more intimate than intentional seduction would have. "Jennifer sounds like she was extraordinary." "She was. And she would have liked you, would have appreciated someone who saw me drowning and threw a life preserver instead of advice about swimming harder." James paused, gathering courage for what he needed to say. "Emma was right. Not sad isn't the same as happy, and you make me happy in ways I thought died with Jennifer. I don't know what we are or what we're becoming, but I know I don't want to waste time pretending I don't feel it." Patricia shifted to face him fully, and something vulnerable flickered in her expression. "I don't want to be your rebound or your rescue or the person who helped you survive crisis. I want to be someone you choose because being with me makes your life better, not because I was convenient when everything fell apart." "You think you're convenient?" James almost laughed despite the circumstances. "You're terrifying. You see through every defense I build and refuse to let me hide behind competence or grief or any other excuse I manufacture. You make me want to be better than I am, which is uncomfortable and necessary and nothing like convenient." The surgeon appeared before Patricia could respond, scrubs still on and expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learn to master. James's heart stopped, every terrible possibility running through his mind in the 3 seconds before the surgeon spoke. "Surgery went perfectly. No complications. Emma's in recovery now. Vitals are strong. You can see her in about 20 minutes once she's more alert." Relief hit James like physical force, buckling his knees if he'd been standing. Patricia's hand tightened around his, sharing the weight of tension releasing, and James let himself cry for the first time since Jennifer's funeral. Not grief this time, but gratitude. The overwhelming evidence that Emma had survived, that the 3% failure margin hadn't claimed his daughter, that they'd get to go home together eventually. Patricia pulled him into embrace that felt like coming home, and James stopped fighting the truth they'd been dancing around for months. Whatever was building between them was real and terrifying and worth protecting, worth the patience they'd promised each other, worth surviving Robert's lawsuit and media speculation and every other obstacle that stood between them and the possibility of building something lasting. Emma woke groggy and uncomfortable but alive, complaining about the chest pain and demanding to know if her scar would be cool enough to show at school. James sat beside her hospital bed and promised she'd be the most impressive first grader at Oakwood Elementary, and Emma smiled before drifting back to medicated sleep. Patricia stayed through the afternoon, leaving only when visiting hours ended, and nurses gently suggested James get actual sleep in the parent accommodation room. She texted him that night, just checking in, letting him know she was thinking of them both, and James felt the last of his resistance crumble. Recovery proceeded exactly as Dr. Foster predicted. 6 weeks of restricted activity that tested Emma's patience and James's sanity in equal measure. Patricia visited twice weekly, bringing books and activities and the kind of steady presence that made hospital rooms feel less institutional. Marcus coordinated meal trains through the parents' network. Brandon and Keisha covered every work emergency, and James learned what it felt like to exist in community instead of isolation. The lawsuit ground forward with the glacial pace of litigation, depositions and discovery, and motions that Patricia's lawyers assured them would ultimately vindicate their position. Robert had overreached, making allegations he couldn't support with evidence, and the case was likely to be dismissed before trial. But the process still drained resources and energy, still made James wake at 3 a.m. running through worst-case scenarios where he lost his job and his reputation and Emma's custody all at once. 16 months after that first knock on his door, James stood in his apartment at 9:47 on a Thursday night, listening to familiar rhythm approach. Emma was asleep, recovering from surgery but healing ahead of schedule. The lawsuit was still pending but losing steam, Robert's credibility eroding under scrutiny. James had survived. No, he'd thrived, built the life Patricia had insisted was possible beyond mere survival. The knock came in 3 sharp bursts. He opened the door to find Patricia standing there, still in work clothes but softer somehow, nervous in ways the CEO never let show professionally. "I'm here to fire you again." James smiled, heart rate jumping. From what this time? From being alone, from pretending we're just friends, from waiting because we think we have to instead of wanting to. Patricia held up her left hand, small velvet box balanced on her palm. Emma gave me permission. We've been planning this for 2 weeks. The world narrowed to Patricia's face, to the vulnerability and hope warring in her expression, to the evidence that she'd chosen him deliberately instead of defaulting to convenient. James thought about Jennifer's promise that he'd love again, about Emma's wisdom that Mommy would want them happy, about the long road from drowning to breathing that Patricia had walked beside him. Yes, the word came out before she'd finished asking, before the box opened to reveal whatever Emma had helped design. Yes to everything. The proposal, the partnership, the life we build together. Yes. Patricia kissed him then, and James felt the final pieces of himself click into place, not erasing Jennifer's memory, but making room for Patricia's presence, not replacing what he'd lost, but acknowledging he was allowed to build something new. When they finally broke apart, Emma's voice drifted from her bedroom. "Did she say yes, Miss Patricia? Did Daddy finally get it right?" They laughed through tears, and Patricia called back confirmation that yes, Daddy had finally figured it out, and Emma's sleepy cheer echoed through the apartment that had witnessed James's breakdown and his rebuilding in equal measure. Later, after Patricia left and Emma drifted back to sleep, and James sat alone with the weight of everything that had changed, he pulled out the framed photo of Jennifer from his bedroom, young and laughing, before cancer and grief and single parenthood had rewritten their story. He traced her smile with one finger, letting himself remember fully instead of flinching from the pain. "Thank you for making me promise to keep living. Thank you for sending Emma to remind me what that meant. And thank you for whatever cosmic nudge brought Patricia to our door when I'd forgotten how to ask for help." The photo didn't answer because photos couldn't, but James felt something release anyway. The guilt that had been keeping him frozen between grief and growth, the fear that moving forward meant betraying memory, the weight of trying to honor the dead by refusing to fully live. Jennifer would want him happy. Emma had been right about that. And Patricia made him happy in ways that complemented rather than erased the love he'd built with Jennifer, in ways that proved hearts were capable of expanding instead of just replacing. James returned the photo to its place and checked on Emma one final time, watching his daughter sleep with the peaceful certainty of children who'd been shown they were loved. The refrigerator drawing had been updated again, 4 figures holding hands now, 3 on the ground and 1 on a cloud that was smiling instead of watching sadly. Emma had added stars around the cloud figure, Jennifer surrounded by the universe she'd promised to observe from. The apartment settled into quiet that felt different from the oppressive silence of early grief. This was peaceful silence, the kind that came from life lived fully instead of existence managed grimly. James allowed himself to imagine the future, Emma's recovery complete, the lawsuit dismissed, Patricia officially part of their family in ways Emma had been manifesting since that first intervention. The cabin trip they'd finally take together, hiking trails and wildlife and teaching Emma that adventure was allowed after crisis. The wedding that would acknowledge Jennifer's presence through Emma's participation instead of pretending the past could be erased. The life that honored what was lost while celebrating what was found. Not sad wasn't the same as happy, Emma had told him. But happiness wasn't betrayal of grief. It was evidence that both could coexist, that people were capable of holding loss and joy simultaneously, that survival was just the first step toward something richer. James had learned that the hard way, through Patricia's intervention and Emma's wisdom and his own reluctant acceptance that asking for help wasn't weakness. He fell asleep that night without checking work email or running through tomorrow's crisis management, without the laptop beside him or the weight of impossible expectations pressing down. Just a father who'd learned to be human again, a man who'd survived grief without letting it define him, someone who'd finally understood that dignity didn't mean drowning alone, it meant having the courage to accept the life preserver when it appeared. The next morning would bring its own challenges. The lawsuit wouldn't resolve itself overnight. Emma's recovery would require patience and adjustment. Robert would probably find new ways to make their lives difficult from whatever position he landed in next. But James had learned something more valuable than crisis management. He'd learned that he didn't have to face anything alone, that community and connection were strengths rather than weaknesses, that the people who knocked on your door at 9:47 p.m. because they couldn't watch you drown were worth building a life around. Patricia had fired him from existing and hired him back into living. Emma had reminded him that love didn't run out, it multiplied. Jennifer had given him permission to find happiness again through the promises she'd extracted before dying. And James had finally learned the lesson that had taken 3 years and one CEO's intervention to absorb, that surviving wasn't the same as thriving, that not sad wasn't the same as happy, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply let people help you remember how to live.